Well, thank you so much, Scott and Jackie, for joining me today. Very excited to talk about the mission and vision of the Phoenix, its founding vision and its efforts so far, and a little bit about its future, and really a topic that I think affects all of our lives, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whoever it may be. I think sobriety, and whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, whether it's whatever, it kind of just affects us all as a community day to day, really. So I think what you guys are building is essential, and kudos for getting this far. But before we got to get into that, Scott, do you want to kind of just walk us through the journey of the Phoenix? Like, what was the catalyst for it? What's a little bit of your background, and what was your reason for founding it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I was probably the one who spent the most time on it in the beginning, because the other folks that sort of co-founded had other jobs at the time, and sort of won them over to the Phoenix side over time. But basically, I had gotten sober in Boston by getting into a boxing gym, and something about that, climbing in the ring for the first time started to heal some of the self-esteem wounds that were really the primary driver of my addiction from experiencing some early childhood trauma. But that then led me to triathlon and climbing and all these other activities. And over the years, I started to sort of kind of gather these friends around me that just wanted to get up at 5 a.m. and go have an adventure rather than stay up till 5 a.m. And Jackie was one of those. We used to go climbing together, and ice climbing and in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and then moved to Colorado and befriended another climber who's in recovery and named Ben Court. And, so we were all sort of talking about how could we share this stuff with others? Because, as in my lived experience, as somebody in recovery, this stuff, every time I stood on top of a mountain or crossed a finish line, it healed those self-esteem wounds. But, Jackie had this clinical lens on it, but was also a climber herself. And Ben had worked in experiential education with youth. And we started to think, how do we share this with other folks? And I didn't know anything about starting a nonprofit. Fortunately, I had a friend who was a lawyer who did the paperwork for us for free. And then we got a notice back that we were officially a nonprofit, and, worked on the name, calling it the Phoenix. It was originally called Phoenix Multisport because we were mostly athletic focused. But we switched it to the Phoenix because we realized that sort of any meaningful activity that people come together around can help others rise. And we do everything now from CrossFit and yoga classes and cycling and climbing. That's still part of our programming, to social events and music and art and all these other different activities. And if you're 48 hours clean and sober, then, check the box. That's the price of admission. And while you're there, you have to adhere to an ethos that's really designed to create a nurturing space. So that's kind of how it got started. But, really it was printing off a bunch of t-shirts with a Phoenix logo on it and giving them to my friends in recovery and folks that believed in it, and allies and supporters like Jackie and others. And, she drafted the first version of the mission statement. So, she was there from the beginning.
Well, that's a great segue to you, Jackie, and talk a little bit about your background. And Scott said you kind of put a clinical lens on this. Talk a little bit about your background and maybe the people you've dealt with through your career and life, and what made you decide to say, hey, I want to dedicate a lot of my time to the Phoenix.
Yeah, I mean, I often joke with people that I didn't choose the Phoenix, it chose me. And I think that some of the best things in life happen that way. My journey as a clinician, frankly, started from a very young age. I was a peer counselor in high school. And so I had this, I don't know, maybe a calling or a curiosity about how to help people, and recognizing that there's just a huge need to try and help people live their best lives. And I thought being a clinician was really the best way to do that. So for upwards of 20 years, I worked as a clinician primarily with youth and families. And in that work, my sort of sweet spot was helping folks who struggle with trauma and had complex mental health challenges. And so as, Scott and I were off climbing, it started to dawn on me that actually there was an opportunity through community to help people heal. And that as a clinician, I didn't have we didn't have a moratorium on healing. In fact,
Right.
you look at churches and other, organizations, like communities, people helping people is sort of at the essence of where most healing happens in the everyday. And so at the time that we were starting, the Phoenix was also heading back to graduate school. I had wanted to get my PhD and do some research, and thought that maybe by better understanding, what, got in people's way, or what sort of interventions might be more helpful, that I could empower social workers to do better by the people they were serving. And, I had seen in my work how often substance use disorder was at the root of, whether it was a child custody issue or trauma issue or justice involvement. It was just always, always there. And so as the idea for the Phoenix started to kind of grow, and as we started to evolve it, I just kept thinking it's really a no-brainer. Like, we had to kind of step into this and do something different. And so I finished the first couple of years of my coursework for my PhD, and then did some time out in Colorado helping get the Phoenix launched and building kind of the essence of the initial model. And then over time, I imagined after I graduated with my PhD, I was going to go into academia, and
sure.
And Phoenix just kept getting bigger and bigger, and our model was evolving, and what we were learning was driving impact, and people's lives were changing. And I realized, one day that I no longer wanted that other pathway, because through what we were doing, I could support and enable more profound change than I ever could as a clinician working one-on-one with individuals, or even teaching cohorts of social workers to go back into the industry. That there was really something more powerful about what we were doing. And frankly, we were able to build something that went around the more traditional systems of care to reach people in a way that they'd never been reached before. So I'm sure we can dig into a lot more, a lot of those pieces, but that's sort of how I landed here.
Before we kind of get into the nitty gritty a little bit, I want to talk just about the scope of what you guys have built so far. Like, where are we at in the Phoenix timeline? Like, community based across the country, whether it's cities, states. Like, give us a couple of facts and figures, because they're pretty impressive of where the community and the organization is at the moment.
Sure. A couple of years ago, we set a goal for ourselves to grow our community 1 million strong. And as of a month or so ago, we exceeded 200,000 members into our community, and the acceleration rate is crazy. So last year, for example, we went into the year with less than 100,000 people, and we ended the year at close to 200,000 people. So we added 100,000 people in the same year that we actually reached 100,000 people. Wow. And so this doubling of our impact and our reach has happened, kind of year over year for the last several. And it's continuing to amplify.
Amazing. Scott, do you want to kind of go into exactly what maybe the Phoenix is, right? When somebody asks you about it, that's, you're at dinner or something, or wherever you might be, and you're talking to somebody and they ask, oh, okay, well, what is the Phoenix? What does it do? How do you explain the scope of it all?
Yeah. I mean, I think I often just say it's a free, sober, active community that's focused on fueling and igniting a movement that transforms the way our country's approaching addiction. And we do that through the inherent sort of transformative power of meaningful activities, and through the community and the connections with others that are built up around that. And then people are like, often are like, well, how do you do that? There's like all these steps to get there. But really, any meaningful activity that somebody wants to lead as a Phoenix event is sort of contained by this ethos that we're here to lift each other up, not pull each other down. And in that spirit, we help each other dream what's possible in our recovery. And also what's happened over the last few years is allies and supporters have started to come as well to Phoenix. And what we're seeing now is that we're really all rising from the ashes of something. We are all, the ashes of the human condition, right? Like, we're all sort of rising from something. And by doing that in nurturing community, it allows all of us to believe in ourselves, even if we don't yet, have that belief on our own. So, you show up at an event, you're welcomed, we circle up, we talk about the ground rules of the ethos. But after that, we just sort of like high five or fist bump and tie into the climbing rope, or get on the yoga mat, or start the art night event. And what really happens is often, the weight of life is on your shoulders coming in, and maybe the stuff you're unpacking or dealing with from your substance use is weighing heavy on you, or you're feeling triggered that day and you're worried about relapsing. And by the end of the Phoenix event, you're kind of laughing and joking with your Phoenix friends, and you feel supported, and maybe the next day you're there supporting others who are in a tough moment. But really what's happening is, you're coming for the activity, but you're staying for the friendships. And it's in those friendships that we begin to heal. And, one reason we've had the growth that Jackie is, sort of shared about is that we had folks reaching out from across the country wanting Phoenix in their communities. So in sort of, instead of us sort of being something that hindered that growth, we just wanted to get out of the way and empower people to start Phoenix themselves. And so most of our new events are added now by volunteers across the country.
Wow. How many states are you guys in now?
41, actually. 41 states, and I think about 170 communities now. So
wow,
almost everywhere.
Well, that also doesn't take into consideration our impact via our virtual platform, because through virtual, we're now in countries around the globe. We have people joining from Ireland, from Dubai, from New Zealand. It's really wild.
I want to talk about, Jackie, like, you've kind of dealt with it from the traditional side, how we deal as a country, maybe as a society, with substance abuse. I guess, what does that traditional framework do right, maybe, but then what can it do much better? The activity part of all this, I think, is such a profound impact, because when we think of, overcoming substance abuse and addiction, it's sitting in a dark room in this, like, with cafeteria chairs and talking. It's a very somber, very depressed atmosphere, it feels like, when we think about getting through this and talking. But when you're outside and you take that sort of mantra and you put it in outdoor activities, whether it's running, whether it's hiking, whether it's through the arts, whether it's through music, whatever it might be, that activity portion seems to be so powerful, rather than traditionally we seem to be very stagnant and very stationary when dealing with this issue. I guess talk about some of the traditional things that we do right, that we don't want to, have a negative word about, but also some things like, look, we've been dealing with this thing for so long, like over 50 years, we need to change some things. We need to innovate. We need to do some disruption within the space. I mean, talk about both sides of the coin there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing with clinical work is there's a lot of research that shows it works, right? That there's, whether it's DBT, CBT, group therapy, inpatient, the research shows that it works and it changes people's lives. The biggest challenge is access. So when you have millions of people who are struggling with alcohol and drugs, and only, 6.5% are able to access care, that creates a problem. So it doesn't matter how good it is. If you can't access it, it's not going to do you any good. And so I think access is a huge challenge that we're trying to take on. And then the other thing that I think is really important is that, again, like removing it from it's not a problem of the clinicians or the failing of individuals, but looking at it from a systems perspective. The rehab industry alone is a $40 billion industry. We are currently facing a shortage of clinicians who are even willing to work in the space. So if we were to double the amount we spend, we still wouldn't have the talent needed to actually reach 15% of the population. And so I think it's just important to step back sometimes and look at that reality and just say, like, is throwing more money at doing the same thing going to actually get us anywhere? Maybe we'll get an incremental shift. But if the last 10 years have shown us anything, the answer is actually no, because the problem has just gotten worse and worse and worse. And so I think from a kind of structural standpoint, that's a challenge. I would also say there's these kind of cultural norms in society that have really kind of influenced where we're at today. We have built our society in a very individualized, pull yourself up by the bootstraps sort of way, where people are responsible for themselves. During the Industrial Revolution, there was a mass exodus of people leaving their families and never going back. And so communities started to shift, and we've undervalued community in our society. Churches have also started to, come undone, and there's fewer people leveraging that kind of community. And I think that's one of the biggest gaps. And if we learned anything during the pandemic, community and connection is what we all crave the most. And if you look at the research shows over and over again that community is what heals. And if you go back to that first question you asked about what works in the clinical world, like for clinicians, what matters most is the relationship. There's been research that shows it doesn't matter what type of intervention you're deploying. Again, CBT, DBT, family systems theory, whatever. But if you have a relationship with the person you're working with, they're far more likely to see improvements. And so that's the kind of thing we started looking at when we were designing the Phoenix. And we said, what can we take from the learnings in the clinical world that keeps us from doing clinical work, but that can actually be impactful? And so it was very clear from day one that relationships were going to be essential. The other piece that's really essential is in a clinical environment, you're really creating a safe environment where people can be vulnerable. And so whether it's, again, drawing upon experience as a clinician or even looking at organizational psychology, where they talk about in order for employees to be successful, you have to have psychological safety in the organization. You have to have an environment that's nurturing and supportive and empowering. And so we started to take those concepts and mold them and test them and try some things out. And what we found is that when we can create an environment that is psychologically safe, that people feel connected, where they can find meaning and hope, they're far more likely to live really well. They're significantly less likely to relapse. They're significantly more likely to stay sober. They report improved health, mental health, quality of life, hope, meaning. It's across the board. We see these powerful outcomes. And frankly, it's just super simple. And the other thing that we learned from kind of the clinical world that I think is really powerful is this idea of meaningful activities. And it's been proven out time and time again. But when you work with kids, you seldom sit down with a child and you say, tell me about your past. Or I'm going to, ask you to do this thing and I want you to share your deepest, darkest secrets. Like, you don't do that. You grab a basketball and you play hoops. You have a checkerboard and you play checkers. And during those kind of activities is when you build trust and sharing can happen. And so for us, leaning in on those activities, again, it comes from that space where, it's working out side by side, walking up that mountain together and sharing the experience where maybe somebody can carry more weight because somebody else is struggling, or somebody might need water and you can share with them. Like, in those moments where you're doing these things that are really challenging in a parallel way, that's when trust is built. And that's how you deepen those relationships. So again, relationships, psychological safety, and a recognition that our current system isn't able to really address this situation has put us in this place of being innovative and coming up with something that, frankly, we think is going to disrupt the entire sector and allow millions of people to live their best lives.
And also, I think an interesting point of all this is the financial burden is not necessarily an aspect that they have to overcome, because that's a barrier to entry, I think, for all this, right? Is you have so much going on in your life and you can't afford to get better. Like, that's also probably a hindrance for many people. You talk about try to disrupt something a little bit. How does that work do you try to partner with local, state, federal government? Do they adhere to your mission and vision, right? Do they agree with it, or they want to be strictly that? Who are the partners in all this that have really realized that this method and philosophy really works well?
I'll give you a couple of things and then I'm going to toss it to Scott, because there's so much that we could get into here. We partner with other recovery organizations, with treatment, with the justice system. We partner with family organizations. We do not do what they do. And so there's no threat that we're going to come in and replace them. All we know is that when we work together, we can extend the impact that one another has, where 1 + 1 = 3, right? We can really drive transformational change when we come together. And so the Phoenix is entirely committed to partnering with anyone who's aligned from a vision and value standpoint, so that we can magnify this impact and really start to shift the paradigm to one of far more bottom up and empowerment. And I'll say one of the kind of current lanes that we're really driving at around partnerships is with the music industry. And so we're partnering with large scale festivals, for example, like Jazz Fest, Bourbon and Beyond. These are festivals that have historically been pretty alcohol and drug forward in terms of norms, who are welcoming in a sober, supportive tent and starting to look at what their practices are and their structures are to improve the experience for folks who are choosing not to drink or use drugs, because we know that over 30% of Americans are living alcohol and drug free. And so it's a huge constituency. And so I think that's going to be one of our more interesting partnerships in the upcoming days.
I think sort of backing up a little bit to the disruptor side of things, like I think I'd love to share this for anyone listening who is trying to be a disruptor in a space that seems very sort of institutionalized, like a fabric of our society is forged and there's no way to change it. I would just encourage those folks to continue to push forward, and when they're thwarted, to try to find ways around whatever obstacle it is. Because I would say there was a period in time of Phoenix's growth where Jackie and I often felt like, do people think we're taking crazy pills here? Because this is like a totally different approach to addressing addiction, where there really aren't even clinicians in the room. There's just a peer who has walked the path a few steps ahead of you, and they're helping you navigate those pitfalls. And it just happens to be on a mountain bike or in a climbing harness or whatever we're in, and it's free and anybody can come as long as they're 48 hours sober. And we just started going back to this mantra of, like, when we hit that block in the road and we didn't know how to get around it, we would just do good Phoenix. We would just be there for the people that are coming, help them rise. And by doing so, they were also helping us rise in our own ways. And by continuing to just focus on our core and doing it well, we started bringing alongside us people that also viewed the need for disruption as something critical in our country. And we found Stand Together Foundation, and they're a group of philanthropists who have this deep belief in people and the intrinsic strength in people, and that sometimes we just have to help sort of move barriers out of the way for that strength to be expressed and for that person to thrive in life. And they saw the magic of Phoenix just in the culture that we had built, because Phoenix is really founded in that belief in people. As soon as you get into Phoenix and you start rising yourself, then you're empowered to turn around and help lift somebody else up by leading other Phoenix events. And that's how we were growing. And they came alongside us and said, if you sort of rebuilt Phoenix today to meet the need in our country, how would we do it differently? And we started really sort of looking at how we could activate volunteers at scale. And we started to realize we needed to integrate technology in a different way. You're talking about a nonprofit that was started before Facebook existed, and a lot has changed since then. And we built our mobile app, and we started, looking for folks in communities across the country that wanted to bring Phoenix to their town and help their loved one or be a beacon of hope to others in their own recovery. And we started training them and activating them and getting them started and getting them on the app. And now essentially within 48 hours, you can raise your hand to start a Phoenix program in your community, and we can get you up and running. And because of our technology platform, we can connect all those folks across the country with other volunteers doing similar things, and they sharpen each other. And we actually start to lean on each other for our unique gifts. And by coming together, we can help a lot of other folks rise. And really what's happening there is there's a self-actualization journey for the folks that are both volunteers and Phoenix members and Phoenix staff. And in that journey, we find a meaningful purpose in life. And really, that's what we're all looking for. Like they've even done some research on folks leaving the criminal justice system. Certainly, you need a job coming out of prison, but a job with purpose plays out differently in your life than just a job, and the likelihood of you going back into the criminal justice system, if you find that life of purpose, goes down. And I think the same is true for addiction. When I started finding a life of purpose in recovery, that was some of the antidote that I needed to inoculate me against my substance use. So I think being a disruptor, you have to kind of carve it out of the wilderness, but share your vision loudly, because you will find people that will come alongside you if you do that. Something
Jackie had mentioned before about the 40 billion, I think you said 40 billion rehab sort of industry, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of just want to talk about that for a second, because I'm sure there's positives, I'm sure there's negatives, right? But when you're dealing with that market size, there's going to be a lot of players in it. There's going to be a lot of interested parties. There's going to be people that might not align. Well, it's just, this is a business model, right? Like, look at private prisons. But I guess, how would you look at the rehab industry as a positive or negative in this sort of overall mission of, sobriety at scale? And getting it to the right people. Access is a big thing you had mentioned. But I guess talk about the industry, much like the clinical side. What does the rehab part industry do well versus what can it do a lot better at?
I think it's a complicated question, honestly, because there are some amazing rehabs out there, and then there are some really awful ones. You've got the whole spectrum.
Yep.
And I think that the problem here is kind of the underlying values that drive those organizations. If you're in the work to improve people's lives, you will make money because you're going to create real impact for people. Whereas if you approach the work to make money first because you want to capitalize on a market opportunity, you're far less likely to be one of those organizations that's going to drive the biggest impact. And so even at the Phoenix, our approach has always been kind of that, and Scott spoke to this before, a bit of a people first approach, where if we can create real value for our members, they're far more likely to then pick up the torch and come back and volunteer or tell someone else about it. And so I think that's sort of the differentiator in the market within the rehab industry, as well as kind of the way in which we think about things. It's and I think it's what sets us apart, frankly, is that real people first approach.
One reason we see so much of the resource around this issue flow through that space is that sort of as a society, we have sort of started to land in a place where we're looking to these experts to sort of solve problems for our communities. And I think, when you really think of community, sort of inherent in that sort of name is that we are there for each other. We're actually there to help lift each other up. And so the idea that some expert's going to sort of swoop into our neighborhood or our town or wherever and fix some of the most complex problems that we're facing, it's just not very likely, And I think if we actually look to each other, then we can start leaning on each other. And because we're so close to the issue, we can actually become the solution. And I think that that's one of the mental models that might need to shift, in that sort of more clinical space or more sort of top-down approaches to this issue, is that thinking of people struggling with substance use as a problem to be solved, as opposed to thinking of them as actually the solution, that each person who's experiencing this has inside them this intrinsic strength. And if we can just create a space where that strength can be expressed, that they can actually be part of the solution to stem the tide of the addiction crisis in our country. And it's just a totally different way of approaching the issue. But by doing so, you then start to think of the solutions totally differently as well.
Yeah. There's so many questions I want to ask, and there's so many roads to go down. And one I want to talk about it is really, look, you have so many people that come into the organization, whether it's alcohol, whatever it may be, whether it's opioids, and now there's sort of fentanyl, right? There's this mega drug. I have a brother of mine who is a cop, and he's works with the DEA. He works on the ground every day. And he says and he's been doing it for, 15 years right now. And he just says he becomes so overwhelmed, and he's just like, he's not defeated because he's great at what he does. Right. But it's just like, it's almost an insurmountable goal. How do you get people off of this? Right. How do you create that environment where a person at their lowest time in their life that is dealing with the greatest drug of all time? Like, how do you guys deal with that over the last 3 years, right? Because it seems like that has really evolved over the last few years, that there has just been this mega spread of really high level drugs that just destroy communities so much. But I know that's a long question, and I know it's very difficult to even talk about, but I just wanted to get your perspective on how do you see that dealing with this issue like day to day.
Yeah, there is a lot there. I'm sure Scott and I both have a lot to say on this one, but I think the thing with the current crisis is that the lethality level is so high that it elevates and it fuels us to work faster and to be more innovative and really target that access challenge in a way that nobody has ever thought about targeting it before, because it just takes one mistake for somebody who maybe even doesn't have a significant problem to lose their life. And so that lethality is driving us fast. I think the way forward, it's not straightforward. We need folks, like your brother, doing the work to get the drugs off the street. At the same time as we have to really get at the root cause of what is fueling addiction and recovery, which again, in our kind of point of view or our mental model around this, is it's really about disconnect from ourselves and others. And so if we can start to create communities and really make it more attractive and more fun and find more meaning in being in community and living your best life, we think we can start to attract more people and tip the scales. And so it doesn't mean that we don't need formal treatment or, police officers out doing their jobs. But while we're doing those things, we also have to shift our culture. Yeah. And so, it's a long game, and we need more people like the Phoenix, frankly, who are innovating and trying to do these other things. I also want to share a story about some folks in Boston. So in Boston, we met some folks from the Boston EMS. And they weren't necessarily in recovery themselves, but they came in and they started working out with us. And in doing that, they realized that, they were seeing folks on their very worst days when they were picking them up off the streets, overdosed, when they, are applying Narcan. And then next thing you know, the person's right back out using, and it would break their hearts and it made them sad and angry. Yep. Right. And then they came in and they started working out alongside our folks who are in recovery and started seeing people in their best days, living their best lives. And it was something that finally started to shift for the folks who are working to have hope, right? To see that change is possible. And so now they partner with us in an even deeper way. They're volunteering. They're actually bringing in some of their folks to do training in the facility that we operate in Boston as a way to kind of make sure that everybody sees that change is really possible. Because if people don't believe change is possible, they are going to surrender. They are going to be hardened, and they're going to look at one approach, which is going to be far more punitive. And so we have to show people that there's another way.
I think I was going to go there too, with where Jackie did with I'd encourage your brother to kind of maybe become a Phoenix volunteer and start a Phoenix event and bring some of his colleagues with him, because I think what he'll see is exactly what Jackie's talking about. To see that sort of intrinsic strength in people is sort of, I always think of it as an ember that's within all of us. And sometimes it's just smoldering and it just needs some oxygen to catch fire. And by coming into that safe and supportive space at a Phoenix event, it can catch fire. And then you'll start to realize that there's so many people out there successfully, stepping into long-term recovery and supporting each other in that journey. And that the hope is actually in our communities everywhere. Sometimes just, it doesn't make it on the evening news, right? It doesn't make it into our social media feeds as much as some of the darker stuff does. And by doing that, then they can start creating that beacon of hope in their community for others, and it grows from there. And I think I'll just sort of double down on what Jackie said around that disconnect from others. And in my story, I experienced early childhood trauma and adverse childhood experience. You can read about the ACE score, which is adverse childhood experience and toxic stress, as a kid. And so for me, that pain really drove me to finding a way to cope with it. And drugs and alcohol was my way to cope. And that worked for me for a while until it started to become destructive also. But, to address things like fentanyl and other stuff, we need, sort of a multifaceted approach. But I think Phoenix's work in that space is to help people sustain their recovery, transform their life, start that self-actualization journey, and interrupt that generational transmission of that pain. So, and I've seen this for myself. I'm now a father and I have 2 kids, and the life that they will have and the home they will grow up in is very different than the home I experienced with alcoholism and a father with untreated mental illness, and if all of the folks coming through Phoenix's doors can interrupt that transmission to the next generation, then we'll start getting ahead of it. And that's the way we're going to stem the tide of this.
I don't know if the demographics of the Phoenix, but like, is there a lot of young people versus older? Like what's the sort of demographics there? Because if you get young people in, that's obviously huge.
Yeah, we definitely have a substantial number of young people, and it's highly impactful for young people. But the beauty is that it because it meets every individual where they're at, it is also beneficial for folks who are in their 30s or 40s, 50s or 60s. We were just talking today on a call about the spread of our population, like the age range. And we have a 91-year-old that's come to the Phoenix in the last year, right? So huge. It really is, it's something that anybody can do because we meet people where they're at. We really are facing an epidemic of loneliness, with upwards of 60% of the population of adults in America reporting that they feel lonely. And when you look at young adults, 18 to 24, that's almost 80%. 80% of our young adults feel lonely. And if you think about that terrifies me, right? Because if loneliness and disconnect is at the heart of the vast majority of our social challenges, how many of those folks are going to struggle with addiction, eating disorders, crime, right? You start to see it spiral. And so to Scott's point, if we don't start to get at those root causes that cause people to feel disconnected, then we are not, as a society, looking very hopeful. But having seen what the Phoenix can do and how community can heal these things, you can really start to flip the switch on that, and the world looks bright again.
The last thing I'll end on here is, about the future, and which I have built so far is absolutely incredible. But when you look at the next decade, I guess, what are some of the goals and successes you would like to reach as an organization?
I think one place where there's a ton of opportunity is to continue to expand our digital platform, our app. So if you go to the App Store and just find the Phoenix, a sober community, you can jump on there. You can come to Phoenix events. You can become a volunteer and start Phoenix events if there aren't any in your community already. And, or you can add more if there are some. And it doesn't matter if you're in recovery or not. We're just looking for folks that want to be part of this movement that changes the way the country's approaching addiction. And I think over time, the idea that we can start having other partners on our app that address different facets of this issue. Maybe it could be workforce development, or maybe it could be helping folks find housing, or, whatever it is. And thereby sort of the size of that community continues to expand, and more people are leaning into that ethos, this idea that we have this intrinsic strength and we can help each other rise. And there's an intrinsic strength within all of us. And my dream for that part of the movement is that we start to change the way the top-down approach this issue, right? Instead of trying to incarcerate our way out of the addiction crisis, or just focus on a drug to get you off drugs or whatever it might be, we can start thinking of ways that we can help activate that intrinsic strength in people and shift the whole space into this more strength-based approach to lots of issues, not just substance use, but across a whole spectrum of things. So changing those mental models and activating communities with bottom-up solutions, I think, is the magic.
In a disruptor sort of way, like, we really have a vision to annihilate addiction. And we believe that elevating community is the way to do that, because through community, not only can we help people today, we can break those patterns and interrupt the intergenerational transmission that will protect society moving forward. And so we know that that's the way to do it, and we just want more people to join us. And so to Scott's point, you don't have to be a person in recovery. You just have to be someone who's looking for community and understands that being a part of community is giving back. And so together we rise and we help one another.
Thank you so much, Scott and Jackie. I love this conversation. I could go for another hour, but I want to be cognizant of your time. So, thank you so much for everything you've done so far, and best of luck for the next decades to come. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having